If you have any questions as I'm moving through the lesson, please feel free to interrupt. If you write them in the chat, I might or might not see, depending on how engrossed I am with this. But as you all know, looking at fabric today. So my still life is right there, easy for me to see. And then I'm going to talk about some pigments. And we're going to talk about monochromatic palettes today. Monochromatic means one color. So you can think of it as in, basically it's two colors though, even though the mono indicates one. Monochromatic is one color and white. So what you're doing is exploring a pigment and how it works with the color white. One exercise that I recommend doing, and it'd be really good if I would have thought to put my color cards out so I could show you. I'm teaching in several different spaces now, so let's just do a really quick color palette of, let's do cadmium red light. A lot of times I start this exercise with ultramarine blue, which is a fun color to start exploring monochromatic with, but it's also a very dark color. So ultramarine blue and cadmium red light are both pretty dark, intense colors. Ultramarine blue has a bit of a darker value, and I think you can kind of see that, especially if you squint at these two little swatches of paint across the top, how the blue recedes a little more. It feels like if you were pretending that you were looking at a shadow, this would be more in shadow than this. So we're going to start with cad red light. And there's a couple ways that you can go with this exercise. You could just make a color card that explores the value. And I would really recommend over time doing a monochromatic color card of every paint pigment that you use. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that. But to start, we're going to do the value mixing. Just like in the previous lessons, we mixed last week black to white with values. We started in the middle with half and half, oops, or close to the middle. Cleaning my palette knife off in between. So let's say that's approximately half and half. Cadmium red goes pretty Valentine's really fast. It's like we're going to be painting carnations. I'll put that little bit of paint there. So the idea is just to make gradient steps from the middle towards white. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm looking and I'm saying, well, how level are my steps? Like how big are the jumps between, I guess is one way to say it. And, you know, there's a pretty big jump from here to here. I think there's a bigger jump from here to here, and these two are a little closer. I'm okay with this jump right here. I think what could happen here, let's try making this one a little darker. Oops. It's always good for you all to see me make a mistake. Let's try making this one a little lighter. I want to try to get it more in the middle between these two. And now we'll jump over here. Usually I like to have 5 steps in between, but looks like maybe today it might be 4. So to my eye, especially on the computer, I added some white there, but you can barely see that difference. That just means I can make a little stronger jump. And I think I could still add a little more. Now, as I did that, oh, my computer froze. I'm still moving in real life, but I can see that still, and that makes me wonder if you can all hear me.
We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know why my pictures froze. It must be my phone. It is. All right, we're gonna pause for a second. I think you're all getting the idea, but I am gonna finish. Let's see, this could be a little lighter. That's kind of a lot of white paint. I'm like at risk of going too far, taking half of that and putting it back over there. Let's just try a little bit. Now, as I moved this value a little further, now it became the same as this. And so sometimes this is the game that happens with value mixing, where I just keep going down the line and adding a little more white and shifting. Because I do want to see incremental differences. And this is an exercise. This is not something long-term as a painter that you have to make yourself do every time you sit down and paint. This is just a really useful exercise as you're learning to learn how to understand value. So I see a gradient happening here. I see a big jump right here between these two. I'm going to take part of this pile and this pile. Try mixing them together. I think this one can go slightly lighter. And a little bit lighter. And we'll just scoop this across so we can see it a little better. That's a good, fairly good gradient, bigger jump here, but it's not going to be a problem as we're imitating this fabric. Now, before I actually start my underpainting, going to go back to that underpainting exercise in a minute and I'll explain more about it. I'm just going to make a quick color card. And so I use printmaking paper for my cards. But if you had canvas paper or old watercolor paper or really heavy drawing paper, that could work too. And so sometimes what I do is, you know, I'll do cadmium red light. And then, I don't know, tomorrow when I come in, I'll do quinacridone magenta. Maybe the next day I'll do a different color. But for today we're going to do, and this is a discussion of tints. Tints is when you take a color and you add white to it. So it's this color and then adding variations of white. Now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I really have 7 steps if you count the colors right out of the tube. I don't need to do all 7 steps. And as I start this color card, I'm taking my bristle brush and I did dip it in water. So, you know, so I almost always, this is a little segue, but I almost always dip my brush in water before I paint with it because it makes the bristles damp and then the paint doesn't just glue itself in there. And so at the end of the day, it's easier to wash the paint out. So I did dip it in there and then I'm kind of drying it off with a cloth. And so for the first swatch that I'm doing, I'm just painting it right out of the tube. This is helpful to hang up on the wall so my brain can be like, that's what cadmium red light looks like right out of the tube. Then I wash my brush out. And I could do all these swatches, but I don't really need that. So instead, I kind of go more towards the middle. And I'm like, okay, this is cadmium red light with some white in it. And then I clean my brush up. And then over here on this end, I don't want to paint just white, but I'll grab this paler description. So you don't have to do this today. If you don't want to, this is an online class. I can't see what you're doing at home. I can't make you do anything, but if you enjoy this kind of process, what I'd say is, start being curious about all your pigments and think about doing a little bit of this kind of color card thing where you do an investigation. So like for quinacridone magenta, I'm not going to paint with that today, but let's just quickly put some out with white. This is magenta is a very purple red, but I do think of it as a red or crimson, not a purple, even though it's very much more in between. Now my water is getting very saturated with white and pink tint from the cadmium red. So I'm going to try to really dry that brush out. And then I've already misplaced my palette knife, so luckily I have a spare going. This one I'm not doing a whole monochromatic study. I'm just mixing this quickly for my color card. So just right here in the middle, let's try half and half. And then over here, I'll just tint this. Ooh, that went a little darker than I wanted. Nah, sometimes I think, oh, I should have not added quite that much, but as I mix, the white takes over a little more. So cleaning off my knife, so my paint just doesn't lay there and dry up on my palette knife like it did last week. See, there's still some dried up acrylic. And then here at the top, already as I make this card, and I don't know if you can see that, I can see that quinacridone magenta is more transparent than the cadmium red light. In real life, my eye picks that up a little bit better. So yeah, for your hypothetical homework, if you feel inspired to try this, I would make some tint studies of every pigment that you have, or if that sounds intimidating, do one of a red, do one of a blue, and do one of a yellow. But you could also make a tint study of your burnt umber, or if you had blues, let's say that you had an ultramarine blue, a phthalo blue, and a cerulean blue, you could do a blue on the top and then tint each of those down. What it does is creates a visual reminder for you of how your paint acts when you add white to it. All right. So this is just, I'll eventually pick another red color and pull it down through here, and then I'll hang that up on the wall. And this is really helpful, if I'm looking, let's say, peonies. I'm painting some peonies, or roses. Sometimes they're in this range. Sometimes they're in this range. Sometimes it's these two colors mixed together. But I actually think that's a fairly good example. Actually, here's this peony has been through it. I've carried it back and forth to a lot of classrooms and it got kind of squashed in my bag. But even though it's fairly brown, some of the petals haven't really turned yet. And I think just by me holding it up here, you can see that this peony if you were picking a base color to start painting with, it wouldn't be cadmium red light, it would be quinacridone magenta. Like these purples are in the magenta range. But if I just had a bunch of tubes of paint lined up and was looking at the table and I wanted pink, I don't necessarily know that in my head I would work that out without having had this experience or this visualization. That's why I'm trying to get you to think about tints, because what I see here really changes when I add white to it. See, there's a reason I hang on to all these dead flowers. It's not because I'm hoarding. I'll probably paint this. It's actually very pretty. But not today, because we're going to work on this fabric that I was showing you all at the beginning. While I know that I have like this little swatch This would be a good moment to have a scissors. I'm pulling this quinacridone off and putting it to the side. I don't need that for the lesson I'm teaching right now. So over here I have my values. I'm looking at this fabric. And now, while we're thinking about tints, I'm also trying to get you to remember back to our underpainting lesson. I'm also taking my spritz bottle and spraying off my paint so it doesn't dry too fast. But think back to lesson 1 when we were just making underpaintings with one dark color. So today, I can start with a contour line. I can start gesturally. I can start drawing with my paintbrush, very specific smaller lines in a rendering process. And so, you know, I'm going to make some choices about how I want to begin. But what I do recommend is let's go to your darkest value and use that for your underpainting color. So I'm using a fairly small brush to get started. And to say that I just paint with contour, I just paint with gesture, it depends on what mood I'm in. And also, I tend to go back and forth a little bit with both. Or I do a contour line, but maybe I do it, I offer it up kind of gesturally. Sometimes it depends what I'm looking at. But as I'm coming in and putting these lines in, I am doing it from sort of a curious, I guess the best way to say it is I'm trying to be curious in my observation. For me, over time, I learned that I paint better if I paint quickly, and I don't think about it too much. Not everybody's wired that way. It might not shock you to find out that I'm an overthinker. That can be a good skill set and it can be problematic. So I learned that, you know, if I just kind of leap in there and try and don't worry about whether I'm doing it right or wrong, eventually I work it out. And I, you know, for example, with these lessons, I take the risk of not doing well while all you are watching me. And the more I teach like this, the less I'm concerned with it, because even when I don't have a good day, I usually get enough information out there that I think it's helpful to you all. So I just sort of trust that because I have the experience over time. But there was a period of time where I was a nervous wreck every time before I taught. So if you ever feel that way about painting, I just guess I want you to know you're not the only one. And some things are scarier to paint than others for whatever reason. So I'm like, okay, here's this fold. Fabric can be a little confusing. It's sort of like painting trees. Tree branches can be like that. You're like, but I was here and now I'm over there and I'm actually 15 feet away from where I thought I was. The thing is that fabric, like trees, nobody's usually looking right at the tree that you just painted. And if you make a little bit of mistake with the branches, like it's not actually that noticeable. So it's better to just think about painting folds in fabric or painting the branches in the tree and not get too hung up on if you made a mistake. If you missed a fold or you added an extra fold in there. So this could be a mountain range in a landscape. And I mean, I think that's something to point out in this moment, is that painting still life can teach you how to paint other things. These aren't disciplines or subjects that don't, they are disciplines or subjects that inform. Like if you learn how to practice painting fabric, for example, it'll help you when you paint things in the distance that have folds, like a mountain range or a hillside. So before I move on to adding in my values, I'm looking at my subject for my darks, and I'm coming in through here still with my very darkest value, and I'm kind of exaggerating those darks and making markers for myself so I remember where they are. Just strong fold over here. And then, excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. I need to just decide how I want to describe the value of the table and the value of the background. And what I'm looking at, I see a wall back here. And then I see a table right here. Some of the table is the same color as this, and some of it is lighter, and some of it's not as light. So before I start describing the light middle values in here, I'm just going to make a decision for the rest of this painting to get these white areas knocked down. If I leave them white while I'm focusing on my subject, then I sort of do myself a disservice, because I'm always trying to work against this very bright white. But I could, and I'm going to pull my palette into the view a little bit more right now. I could pick a value on here to lay down and describe these sort of outer areas, and then that'll help me as I move back and forth on the actual fabric. So I'm going to make it a little washy, just so that I can stretch the paint. I'm adding some water here, and then I'm just coming in. Well, I should have waited a few weeks, could have done, oh, I guess my February class isn't online. So it, but still, we could have done this Valentine's pink exercise for the February 14th week. That would involve some backtracking, and you all need that lesson right now. So just pulling this wash across. I'm not even sure if this is the perfect value. It can be hard in my mind to look at the color of the tabletop that I see here and match the value. Actually, looking on the camera, I can tell that this value is a little lighter than it probably needs to be. But I'm going to stick with my choice, because I can always layer darker or lighter color over it. And most importantly, I just want to get that white was way too light in value. So I want to get that pulled darker. I am doing this dance of trying to keep my palette in the painting so you can see it, but I'll push this paint over here on these edges. So That's my start for my fabric. I'm going to go back to my little brush. I was using a bigger filbert to try to fill those areas in. Let's just start looking right here at this fold. Not thinking so much about the background anymore, but as an experiment, I'm pulling this middle value across. And depending what mood I'm in, I almost just think about this a little bit like fill in the blank. I'm like, well, let's just get the values on there. And if they're not perfect, that's okay. Maybe this could go a little lighter across here. So I start painting wet paint on wet paint. And I can see as I'm getting these layers on here that I do wish that I would have made my background darker because it's a little close to the fabric and my eye is fighting with that a little bit. So just taking some of this very dark red, almost it's an exaggeration of the value, but in the background, at least for now, pulling that across just to help my eye. And if I decide this is too dark in the long run, I can put a lighter value back over top of it. So now back to my study. This is lighter. I already have a lot of lines in there, so I'm sort of focusing on just trying to get some value down that's in the right direction, even if it's not perfect. So this is a study going toward the darker value because this area of the fabric is in shadow. Now, the thing about cadmium red that will be a little different than if we were doing this exercise with ultramarine blue is that the darkest values aren't very dark, not nearly as dark as blue, or especially the blue black mixture. So this shadow interior in here, I really wish that I could pull that very dark, but I just don't have that with this color. So that's notable and something that you learn as you're doing this exercise. You just do the best with what you have. I also can see that there's a bit of a shadow right here. So pulling that back in. I'm just going to, I think, go from right to left. And so before I come and push back through here, looking at this fold of fabric across the front. And I can notice on my palette, everything's getting all smeared together. I'm mixing a lot together. That's not a problem. I can also take my larger brush and push this darker down here too. Softening some of that line into the wet paint. I feel like as this pulls out, that even more light hits it. And then taking that wet paint on wet paint and blending it in across. So if you're a new painter or you're trying to practice your skills, practicing monochromatic observations, you could do that for 6 months. Like, let's say next week we go into class and I'm going to start, it'll be our last class of the month, I believe. I'm going to show you how to mix color palette in a very simple triangular way, because mixing color palettes, that's not something you just learn in one class. That's something that you sort of scratch the surface of in that first class. So let's say after next week, you walk away and you feel fairly intimidated by the idea of the color mixing. It would be okay to revert back and just practice monochromatic value mixing and making monochromatic paintings for a while till you felt ready. There's quite a lot of, I left a lot of white paint on that one spot, and so I'm kind of thinning it out and pulling it across, being a little more sensitive to the light. And then in my description, for some reason, in my line work at the beginning, I just left this part out. So let's pull that back in here. Okay, light hits here quite a lot. This is more in shadow. This is actually a little lighter through here. Lighter. Okay, we have 13 minutes for me to work on this demo. And then I'm going to check in with everybody unless you write in the chat. Please don't check in with me today, or not for me today. It doesn't bother me if you don't want to check in, but I'm definitely going to make that good college try today. So kind of check in with yourself now during the next 10 minutes and see if you want to talk with me, or if you're like, nah, I'm happy just to show up and watch. But communicate that to me so I know. Thanks, Megan. So right now, this honestly doesn't, to my eye, look a whole lot like fabric. This could be a pile of, I don't know, raw meat, or like just something gloppy. But I'm not too concerned with that. I know that in time, as I keep looking at the details and being curious about trying to describe what I see happening, that it'll pull together. And I think that often, I notice this with students, and it totally happens with me too, is that there's this sort of transitional period, like where you're in that earlier stage, but not the beginning of the painting. And you're like, what am I doing? And I don't feel so good. Like this is a mess. And that is the point in the part. Do not quit. Especially don't hang up your paintbrushes and say, I can never be a painter, because that'll be the spot you'll be stuck at for until you start again. These transitions, you just have to sort of blindly try to push yourself through it. Even if you think you feel like an imposter and you don't know what you're doing. The only difference between somebody who looks like they knew what they're doing and their painting looks like it's more successful is that they probably have done it more. They've probably painted more than you have or thought about it. So you just have to stick with it and be willing to let yourself feel like you're failing, which I realize is not always easy, and it's kind of a tall order. It happens often to me when maybe I start a new subject matter. You know, I get pretty good at painting certain things over and over again, but then you're like, well, let's paint horses this week. I'd be a little bit like a big gulp. You know, painting horses is like, that takes some time. I'd have to practice some drawings and do these different things to feel prepared to address what a horse looks like. In the shadow, I can see a little bit of light coming forward. So I'm just trying to work in this lighter value. So this thing happens when I paint on my own and I'm starting to run out of time, where I'm like, well, I have my palette mixed up, so I'm just going to fill in all the white areas, even if I make a mistake. Like, I've got 5 minutes to do this before I need to go read my child a bedtime story or whatever it's been in my life, you know, go to work, get to an appointment, go to a Zoom meeting. So now at this point, I'm like, oh, I have to move on in my class. So I'm just quickly, and with a little bit of discernment, being like, where are these values, and trying to toss them in there. This is a little darker. This is lighter. If you are a painter that takes care of other people, I think you might find yourself thrown into the world of gestural painting just as a way to try to find time to paint. I certainly think that was part of my experience. I've literally glued my palette to the paper here while we're working across. So I'm just quickly going to throw in this paint across here. If I run out of value, I can always pull from a different end of my palette. I think when I paint, this is not the first fabric demo I painted, maybe the second. It's actually a little intimidating. I think painting fabric is challenging, and one of the ways that I deal with it in my still life is by being sort of non-committal to it. It's there, but I'm not trying to say too much about it, because usually the focal point in a still life or a painting I'm making might be the skull or the flower arrangement. So the fabric becomes an afterthought, which is sort of how I'm addressing this right now. But when I did the other demo, it ended up looking very abstract. And I don't think that's a problem. usually things that start abstract, if I really want to pull the detail back in, I can. Like if I want to become more descriptive over top, I think it's helpful for me to have kind of a looser base. Now, just for the sake of my eye, oh, frozen again. What is my iPhone trying to tell me? I'm gonna jump down here and look. I don't know why my iPhone keeps jumping out. I'm sorry about that. I'm gonna reconnect again. All right, pulling my dark color down through here because I can see better. I'm going to put my palette over to the side now. I have a little stand next to my table for it. Just so I can get a better picture. Now, over here, I feel like this line, I'm looking, at my subject. I feel like this could be a little sharper. And that kind of helps settle it and allow it to look more like fabric. As far as the value study, this is a good start. It's not perfect. I don't have it all completely tuned in, but there's enough information that it's starting to come together. A few last touches, recognizing, that it's not finished, but I'm like, okay, there's a lighter, the light hits here, and then light comes across here. Definitely a little more light up here. And then just blending that into the wet paint. Also, these very white little pops that are coming through, that's just places I didn't paint yet. And so I can make them a little more neutral too. This interior right here is one of my darker shadows. And then it comes across because it's almost like there's a fold of fabric within the fabric. And then there's more folds, shadows in here. So it just becomes kind of like a game or a puzzle where I start looking for those folds and how to hone in on the description. So I'm like, this could be a little fuller in here. And then there's more shadow. This kind of spills into more shadow across here. So that line could be softer. This line could be softer. These highlights shouldn't be quite so light. So like pulling a slightly more middle value across here. Some of where my lights are really light, I'd probably be pulling more middle tones in as my next step. A lot of going back and forth with that, because right now some of the contrasts are higher than they need to be. So sort of bringing it onto the same playing field. A fun but challenging value study. For me, more intrinsically interesting than if I was just painting an apple. I feel like 5 to 10 minutes into the apple on a monochromatic study, I'm sort of like, well, I said what I need to say about this. You know, there's not a lot going on. Where the fabric gives, it's more of a puzzle, and it gives me a lot more of a challenge. That said, you know, you might start with simpler things and work your way up to things that are more complicated. All right, I'm going to take just like a 2 or 3 minute break here, and then I'll be right back to start checking in. So sometimes when I can't see what the what values are, like they're a little confusing, I'm painting very neutral fabric in a different tone. Cadmium red pigment is not tan like this fabric. And then my tabletop is also fairly similar to the fabric. I'll squint. I squint at the thing that I'm looking at, and I say, which value is actually lighter? So the tabletop value is slightly lighter than my fabric. And the first tone I put on there wasn't quite light enough, and that tone is too light. So maybe getting a little closer. Let's try this one. And so now I'm looking at my shadows, which are soft, and it's not a super hard line the way this table is underneath. The fabric's coming out there. But just getting this lighter value in here. Set it, I think that's going to settle things down a little bit. And so my brush is pretty saturated with paint, but I'm going to just take this dry rag and kind of try to pull some of that paint off to make the brush drier, and then look for where the shadows are softer. So I'm pulling more paint off my brush to make it drier. Sometimes I just use another brush and just softening the edge of that shadow. It's okay to soften it some places and leave it be a little harder in others. There's actually a little more light that gets up in here. And you know, the background I'm looking at is a little darker. It's not as dark as I painted it, but I think for now I'm going to, maybe what I'll do is I see the horizon of this tabletop. And I feel like I could have left that out, but that information might be kind of helpful to the context. Maybe that line could be slightly sharper. Actually putting a little water in there. Sometimes making my paint a little looser makes it easier for me to indicate a sharper line. Part of it is that my paper is wavy with the paint water. So now I'm gonna maybe for a minute stick with this bigger brush as I'm trying to imitate my values. And let's try this value right here. I'm coming back over top with a, this is fairly washy in texture. And then trying to almost soften. Some of my transitions. This over here could go a little lighter than I have it. So right here, some of my paint's a little more transparent right now. Like I've added some water to it to make it almost like a watercolor. Oop, that's a little strong. We're covering up a little more of the dark than I wanted. So now I'm coming in with my rag and pulling back out. And actually this is a moment I think to bring in my smaller brush with some dark paint and just kind of studying where the shadow is. And then across here, it comes down a little further. And out here, maybe the light's hitting a little more. So these marks I'm starting to make are more rendering marks. I'm moving my fingers and a little bit more my wrist, not the way I started when I was kind of sweeping more through my shoulder. We're all going to adjust that differently. Softening this edge. Could be a little lighter right here. Some places I go to add the light and my paint's actually really wet. So I'm like, well, I'll have to come back to that later. In here. this line right here. Also, within this shadow, there's more fabric showing that I sort of lost. And then there's a hard edge across here. There's also more of a sharper transition in here. This is deeper and darker. And then it softens. And from underneath, it's also in shadow. This could go a little darker. And then over here, I can see too, there's more shadow. There's also shadow comes out across here. Okay, Kim, thanks for joining. Have a great day. Sometimes I have water and pull across one side of what I just added to soften it. Sometimes I soften those lines with a dry brush. So now drying off my brush and then softly blending this over here. Because what happens is this fabric really pulls forward when I'm looking from there. Also, there's a little more light hitting right here. this comes forward. This line kind of took over. That area is more in shadow. More in shadow down here. Oh, no problem, Jody. I can talk about that right now. And what really happens, I think, with brush choice is that it's super subjective. So, which I feel like that's a tough answer to give a beginning painter because you're just like, I don't know what I like yet. So what I choose has to do often with how it feels to me, but I will talk about the brushes I'm using right now and why as we're finishing out this class, because it is a good question. And for me, with teaching 4 classes a week, I don't remember necessarily what I mentioned about brushes to you all versus my Thursday night class. So just kind of softening that line there. So this little brush is one of my favorites. And it's a number 1 white Taklon flat. I like flat brushes personally better than round brushes because round brushes tend to splay. I'm a pretty gestural painter and I'm pushing my brushes into the paper quite a bit. And so I feel like with this brush and it being a white sable versus the filbert bristle that I was using, that it's softer. It doesn't leave as many lines. It gives me a lot of control because I get the thin line and the fuller line. But it's small enough that for me, this is like the equivalent of using a pen or a pencil because I have so much control. Somebody the other day asked me like about long brushes versus short brushes. Also, it's kind of like choosing what clothes you wear, like what feels comfortable to you. I think I do prefer long brushes, and I'm not exactly sure why. It might be something to do with the balance. The 2 main brushes that I used today, I jumped between a filbert, which has hog bristles. I really like using bristle brushes with acrylic painting because with the sable brush, I feel like more of the paint sticks to the brush and I have to work a little harder to get opaque paint onto the paper. With the bristle brush, I feel like as I put paint onto the paper, that it really stays on the paper. And also I can be fairly assertive with these brushes and it doesn't damage them. This one has been really mistreated over time. It's probably a Princeton brush. The label, oh here I can see it right now. It says Princeton Brush Company. It's kind of a cheaper brush, honestly. And you can see that by the way that, I don't know how well it's showing up, maybe on this dark background. These are splaying a little bit. And that happens with the more Academy brushes. The Utrecht interlocked bristle brushes, I think, are a worthy investment because they tend not to have the splaying, the way that the brush pieces, the little bristles are put into the ferrule. it's worth spending the extra money. So like, I think a pack of Utrecht brushes that are kind of long, like this one that might have flats and filberts in it, would have 5 or 6 brushes. It may be $42 to $60 for a pack, but those brushes will last you, those bristle brushes will last you for years if you take good care of them. This filbert, what I like about a filbert is really a round brush pressed flat. Once again, I get the skinny edge and I get the fat edge. So I could use this brush to make a lot of ground in the foreground and the background. It covered a lot of area when I was trying to get these areas filled up with paint fast. Also, I find bristle brushes, drying them off and using them to soften edges, they're better at that. Whereas the sable brush wants to pull the paint up into it or not take any paint off. I feel like the paint's just more responsive to letting go. Round brushes, which I didn't use today and I don't use as often, but some people really love. I tend to use more for finishing paintings and when I need to do more intricate little details, like if I want to come in here and really sharply describe the shadow, I often with a round brush will look for just a fake brown sable. That's what most of them are. And I buy them cheaply. I buy the cheap $10 real value packs because they don't hold up as long. And I'd probably spend a little more money on my bristle brush, which I can make last for years. Is this helping, Jody? And do you have any specific brush questions?
No, this is super helpful. And no specific questions. I think what I'm kind of doing today is just experimenting and seeing what they do in my hand. But I just wanted to get your. It's always good to get a little info from you.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I like having the question because I don't know what you don't know. Like all of you, when you show up, like I don't even remember what I necessarily told you. You know, I have a certain way I organize this, but I go off on these tangents every week. So, you know, other than the very basics, I'm just like, what do you need to know? I will say what I would do is pay attention to what brushes you do like, and then look at the label. You know, this white Taklon flat, I think somebody left one of these in my classroom one time, and after a couple of years I picked up and started using it, and then I was like, wait, I really like this. And so then I looked on the label, I went to a couple of art stores and I couldn't find it, and finally I ordered it on Amazon. And I just ordered a bunch of them to be delivered at once. I hear that a art store in San Francisco has them and one in Seattle from my students commenting on it. But if I really like a brush, then I buy more of them because this brush is probably the 10th one I've bought in maybe 3 years. And I have a few extra in case I lose it. But this is one that is a real solid for me. It's a solid for acrylic painting. And for paintings that are 22 by 30 inches or smaller, I would not use this brush on an 8 by 10 foot oil painting. If I'm painting super large, the smallest brush I would use would probably be, this would be my tiny brush. You know, so sometimes the type and size of brush that you choose to use depends on the type of and size of paper. If you're always painting on a 5 by 7 inch page, you might not need a size 8 or 10 filbert. you might want to go for size 6 or less. So yeah, those are some thoughts, particularly around the types for acrylic.
And may I ask, you said they'll last X amount of time if you take very good care of them. Can you tell us what taking very good care of your brush means?
Well, I can tell you I don't take very good care of my brushes, like especially because like if I teach 2 classes in a row, I might leave and forget to clean them out. So I lose a lot of brushes. And this one, you can see how much paint is stained in there. It's because maybe I rinse them out, my acrylic brushes out in my jar and dry them off with a rag versus using a little soap and water in the sink. There is something called Masters Brush Soap and Conditioner, and I'm just sort of looking around to see if I have a can of that handy to show you, because if you want to take a good care of your brushes, that is what to wash them out with instead of dish soap. Dish soap, just like you wouldn't wash your hair with dish soap. Yeah, I don't have that handy. I'll see, I'll Google it right now. Dish soap is totally fine.
Hey, Jolene, I have
Oh,
some.
yeah. Who's this?
This is Elise. Hi.
Okay, I'm gonna pin you right, or thank you for making me not have to Google that. That is exactly, that is a really good way to take care of your brushes. And so you open that can up and you take a little scoop of it out, or you run your brush across it. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you.
And then, so I get a little bit of that on there, and then I go like this in the palm of my hand with the brush to work the conditioner and soap into the ferrule. And then I rinse them out under warm water in the sink. And I usually flick the water off to try to get the brush and then form it with my fingers so that the bristles lay the way that I want. And then I store them up in a jar so that the tops are out to air dry. If I'm having problems with a brush like this one, where it's splaying, sometimes I take a piece of paper and wrap it around there and wrap tape around it to reform it. With my lifestyle currently, that's not something I'm taking the time to do between painting or classes. Occasionally, if I get a bunch of these, I have hundreds of brushes here. Some are for oil, some are for acrylic. But I'll sit down and take a dozen of them and kind of address what's going on. If I let paint dry up in a brush and I really like it and I want to try to pull it back to life, I might take a little jar and put like Dawn dish soap or something and soak it in there, and then try to break the paint apart with my fingernails and rinse it out. Sometimes it works and I get the brush back, and sometimes I just have to let it go and throw it out. So I say the most important thing to do probably is to run them underwater in the sink when you're finished with them and let them air dry upside down. Get the brush conditioner soap to use, and if you don't have it, try to do it with water without soap. But if there's a lot of paint hanging out in there and you need to use soap, don't worry about it too much. It's totally fine to use hand soap. And if you're really wanting to get that paint out of there, like dish soap is a good solution. Yeah, I think that kind of covers it.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Sure. Very good question and a good note to end on. So, all right, everybody, have a great week. Next week, we'll start color mixing.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye. Bye, Henry.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.